In this video, I'll be building this media center with a hidden charging station. If you haven't yet, click that subscribe button. Thanks. So let's start with the initial idea. The client wanted something that was asymmetrical and modern. I started off essentially with two boxes overlapping each other. From there, it became one solid box and a negative box. To keep the design from looking too boxy, I scaled a portion of the solid box smaller and then added an angle to give it a sense of direction. This angle was carried out throughout the design to tie everything together. Once the sketch was completed, I modeled it in SketchUp to finalize the scale and proportion of the design. With the design complete, we figured that the solid box would be made from plywood and painted white, while everything else would be made from solid walnut. This decision was based on the budget that the client had for the build. Once everything was signed off, I went ahead and started the building process, which was to mill up all of the walnut. Since this part is pretty straightforward, I'll let my friend Daniel serenade you with some awesome tunes. Hit it, Daniel! Ooh, that's some good looking walnut. Alright, thanks Daniel. Back to my voice. So with all of the walnut milled, I'll go ahead and cut them down to the right lengths. This is going to be for the negative box portion, which consists of only the top, the side, and the bottom. I'm using dominoes only for alignment. I'm not too worried about the strength. I want to make sure that all the boards will be glued together and it's going to stay nice and flat. Sometimes if you glue these larger boards together, they might shift on you during the process. If you have a biscuit joiner or if you have cauls, it works essentially the same way. I don't have a video of me clamping these boards together, but you're still going to need to use clamps even though you're using some kind of domino or biscuit to align things together. Once the glue dried, I went ahead and sanded everything down. And I know some of you guys are going to say this, why don't you have your shop vac on? Well, I didn't have the proper adapter that is needed for the Festool Rotex, so I couldn't connect it. But this is just rough sanding. I know it's going to leave a little bit of scratch marks. I still needed to fill the holes and the knots inside the walnut, so I'll do the final sanding later. Once the rough sanding was done, I trimmed down the side and the bottom panel on the table saw. The top was pretty big, so I couldn't do this on the table saw. I went ahead and trimmed down the top using the track saw. To join the top, side, and bottoms together, I'm using mitered corners reinforced with dominoes. My track saw doesn't cut all the way, so that little ledge you see there will be sanded down. To fill the knots and voids, I'm using a 2-to-1 mix epoxy, tinting it with some black mica powder. The black blends in really well once the walnuts finish. I like using epoxy for this because it seeps deep into the wood. Sometimes it comes out on the other side, so you want to make sure that you're taping the other side. And once the epoxy dries, you can just sand it like you would sand any other piece of wood. Now let's move to the wireless charging station. I'm just using a charging pad I found on Amazon. I'll trace it out as well as the area for the cable management. I'll use my router to roughly route out the area for this. I'll come back later with a template to finalize the actual shape. To get this area perfect, I'm going to use the CNC to create the template for my router. I'll also create the cover cap out of walnut to match the top. Since I'm using the CNC, the shape will fit perfectly into the area that I route with my template. To use a router for something like this, you'll need a patterning bit or bushings so that the bit will be able to ride up against the wall of the template to follow the template shape. One thing to mention is that I offset the cut line on the CNC for the cap to the inside of my shape so that the cap will have a small amount of wiggle room. Since the charging pad only allows for 7mm max separation between the phone and the pad surface, I'm using springs to keep the pad pressed up against the walnut top. The springs are set in some super glue that was cured with some spray accelerator, and the cap is secured with 3 screws. This white epoxy filled thunderbolt indicator will designate where the center of the charging pad is located. That way, they will know where to set the phone for charging. I can now add my dominoes to these mitered corners and glue all of the walnut panels together. Now, clamping corners could be really tricky, but having a set of corner clamps really helps with keeping the corners at a perfect 90. I highly recommend a set if you don't have one already. Since these corners are mitered, I needed to create some braces that will allow me to clamp them together and not have them slip past each other. I cut a few pieces out of plywood and secured them near the corner so that when I clamp on the 45-degree edge, it will apply pressure directly down the center of my mitered corner. With the walnut portion complete, I can start on the white box, which consists of 2 compartments with adjustable shelves and doors, and 2 compartments with drawers and drawer fronts. I'll also integrate the handles and highlight them with an accent of walnut. Like all projects where I'm using large sheet goods, I'm going to break them down with a track saw into rough sizes before trimming them to their final size on the table saw. This method is definitely a lot safer if you don't have a way to balance a full sheet of plywood on your table saw. Whenever I'm cutting out these rough pieces, I'm giving myself about an inch of extra material. That way I can square things up on the table saw. If you don't have a track saw, you can always use a circular saw with a straight edge to make these cuts. To join these panels together, I'm using rabbets for the corners and dados for my dividers to divide up the compartments. If you don't have a dado stack, I made a video of a jig that allows you to make perfect size dados, rabbits, and half laps with a router. I also have free plans for that jig if you want to make one yourself. The link is in the description below, or you can click that icon on the top right corner. The rabbit will strengthen the corners of the connection, and the dados will give me a perfect location for my divider. I created a test dado before I actually cut the final piece, but for some reason, this dado was really tight. There's nothing a swing of a mallet can't do. I'll secure everything with clamps and let it dry overnight. I forgot to create the rabbits for my back panels, so I inset the back panels and secured them in place with some pin nails and glue. There are some small gaps, but I'll use some caulking later to seal these areas since I'm painting the inside as well. I know some of you guys might say, caulk and paint, make a carpenter what he ain't. And you're right, it makes him a painter. I've always caulked the inside corners of my cabinets whenever I go to paint. It's personal preference, I think it just looks a lot better that way. To create the adjustable shelves, I'm using this jig to drill out all my holes. You definitely want some kind of template to drill these holes in the exact location, but if you could get a jig like this, it would definitely speed things up. Yes, I'm aware I'm not the best at caulking. Usually there's a tool that you use to remove the excess. I didn't have a tool and I didn't want to go out and buy one, so I'm just going to use my fingers. The key is to not apply too much caulking. You don't want to put so much on there that it just bleeds everywhere when you're removing it. You want to make sure that you just put just enough to seal up all the gaps. One thing I forgot to record was the edge of the plywoods. What I did was filled it with wood filler. I have another video going through that step in detail, link in the description. Moving on to the doors, I'm going to lay out the lines for the integrated door pulls. I'm including this angle so that it ties in with the angle on the box as well as the shelves. I think it's going to look really nice, but the trick is I need to make a back bevel on the bottom of this pull. So I had to tilt the entire table of my bandsaw to get the proper angle for me to cut the back bevel. It wasn't too bad because I only needed to make this weird cut on one of the doors, and this is what it's supposed to look like. To create the walnut accent in the pulls, I went ahead and sandwiched a piece of walnut between the front panel and a 1/4 inch back panel. This made all the fronts a total of 1 inch thick, which is not very typical when you're making cabinet fronts. To get the walnut veneer to the right thickness, I'm using a drum sander to get it down to about 1/8 of an inch, and then I'll cut them to the right width on the table saw. Then I'll do a test fit on the fronts before gluing them into place. This is the 1/4 inch back panel that I mentioned earlier. It's just to clean up the back so that you don't see the walnut piece. Set aside the fronts to let it dry. While they're drying, I'm going to install the slides. I raised the slides up about 3/4 of an inch, about the sheet of plywood, and I use that as blocking. And then with that location, I can now go ahead and mount the slides onto the drawers. Because of this weird thickness on my doors, the door hardware needed to be placed in a way that accommodates for the swing clearances. To do this, I created a jig using the piece that was the same thickness of the doors. I drilled out and installed the hinge side first and located the mounting plate with a jig. I then tested to ensure that the door will open and operate without issues, and once I got that location set, I installed the hinge on the actual door panel. With all the parts complete, I can go ahead and paint. I'll be spraying the paint using an HVLP system, so I need to tape out all of the walnut pieces first, making sure that I don't get any paint on the walnut. And then I'll roll out one coat of primer, let it dry, then go back to sand the primer down. With the primer sanded smooth, I'll go ahead and apply 2 coats of oil-based paint. Before I spray anything, I need to make sure that I thin it out properly because I'm using an HVLP system. If you're using an airless, you probably don't need to thin it out. One thing to mention is I do sand down the paint between coats with 400 grit sandpaper. As the paint dries, I'll start on the base for the white box. I'm cutting the plywood so that it matches the thickness of the walnut panels. The white box will sit on the walnut panel I made earlier in this base, so it has to be perfectly aligned. I'll secure the base with glue and nails, and then cover the plywood faces with some strips of walnut veneer. To secure the base to the white box, I'm just going to use L brackets. You can find this at the big box store. It's not really complicated. You just screw it down into the plywood base and then screw it into the box. Make sure that I use the right length screw so that it doesn't poke through the box. I'll do a dry fit before securing the walnut into the white box. I need to make sure that the entire piece was 10 foot long. I'll shift the walnut piece back and forth to get that 10-foot dimension. Once it's set, I'll secure the white box into the walnut using threaded insert and bolts. I'll drill through the white box first into the walnut. That way I know exactly where to place my threaded insert in the walnut. The 2 parts of the white box are secured together using wood screws. I installed 2 on both sides of that center divider. Now all I have to do is finish the walnut. I'm using Rubio Monocoat and it's super easy to apply this finish. I really love how the grain pops, and this walnut has some really special figuring in some of the areas. So applying an oil finish really makes those figured areas stand out. Yes, I'm using an old expired driver's license. It was the only card I could find at the time, so don't judge me. I'll go ahead and set the pad in place, cover it with my cover cap, and test to make sure it works. And it works. With the bulk of the work done, I can then focus my efforts on creating these shelves. These shelves are pretty simple, just plywood painted and a walnut accent in the back. These shelves will have the same profile thickness as the walnut top, which is 1.5 inches. So I'm going to glue together two pieces of 3/4 inch plywood. At the table saw, I'll trim everything down to the final dimensions. I'm going to create rabbits on the bottom panel as well as the top panel. That way the side panels has a nice little ledge that it can sit on and it'll be secured in place with glue. I'm going to mill up the slab of walnut, which is pretty much the exact length that I need for the walnut back panels. I'll resaw this slab into 3 pieces and then use a planer to bring it down to the right thickness. And finally, I'll add the angle to this back walnut piece to be similar to the angle I used on the white box. Since the shelves are painted, I can't glue this piece into place. And since this is going to be up against the wall, you won't see the pocket screws, so I'll just go ahead and use that. And finally, this project is done. Even though this design was really simple, there are certain aspects of the project that really challenged me. In the end, I'm super happy with how it turned out. If you like this video, hit that like button and definitely subscribe. Thanks.